system for a mobile platform, being that it's a powered device with battery power, and it has lots of wireless interfaces and very low memory, CPU and RAM. So every OS, if you look at an example of, let's say, Linux, everything is accessed using a file set, using a file interface. So if you want to write to a file, that's fine, but even if you want to write to a hardware device, still it's a file. Network device, it's a file. So everything goes through the file. The log is maintained through file. You can do almost everything by opening and writing a file. Windows also uses something similar, but there are some differences. And then Symbian OS decided to use servers instead of files. So all the operations that you would do through the system's calls, it will go through a server. It follows the client server model. So if we look at the core of the operating system and we saw what a kernel is, depending on three different things or three different types. One is the monolithic kernel, where everything which is core to the operating system for process management, memory management is included in the kernel. All the hardware drivers that you would have for mouse, device driver, USB, everything, that all gets loaded inside the kernel. So the kernel is built. And one example of this is Linux. So the advantage of this is, why do we do this? So the advantage is it's very fast. Since everything goes inside the kernel, the operating system is very fast when it executes. It doesn't have to go outside the kernel, because whenever we switch the mode from user level to kernel and back and forth, there is an overhead. You have to do something in the processor, you have to set and unset bits, you have to swap out the memories and so on for the protection. So this Linux is very fast, and the reason is it has monolithic kernel. But the penalty is at the boot time, you have to load so many. It takes time to turn on the computer. Another approach is microkernel, and this is typically used nowadays in Apple computers. So the difference is the kernel part is very small. So if you switch on the computer, it will switch on very fast. But what happens is when you load, for example, if you connect your webcam, it will take time to load everything inside the memory and then start it. So that way the operations become slow. So but people are going or moving towards this direction nowadays, because the processor has become so fast that, I mean, even if you load everything at the runtime, it's still okay. Symbian OS also in the phone world is using the microkernel approach, primarily because when you switch on the phone, you don't want it to take a lot of time. And then there is a hybrid approach where you do both of the things. So some things are in the kernel, but it's not a microkernel, and so on. So whenever you write user software, everything will go inside the kernel, because kernel contains everything. In the microkernel, the kernel is very small, and as you can see in the Symbian OS, some is implemented using servers. So what happens is, all the user programs, they first connect to servers, and through server they will access all the system calls. So this is the difference. Now there is a way of interaction, and that slows something, but then even if you change the device, you update the device, itself is written using C++, it's object oriented, as opposed to Linux, which is totally C. So you have all this, so you can open up the file and it will appear as an object, and then there will be, so data will be part of it, and also the functions that will come up. So for example, even your SMS message will be an object, so that when you operate on that SMS message, you get the data part and also the functions part. So the whole idea of Symbian OS, and if you do so we are not going to write any program in Symbian C++, but you can as well do that instead of using Java. And if you do that, it's all object oriented. So it has multitasking, that means it supports multiple processes, and it's also multi-threaded. So in the programming assignments, I will ask you to write multi-threaded programs also. File system is typically FAT32 because it's compatible with a lot of other devices. Most of the computers in the world are Windows, and and so it gets compatible with that device also. But you can support other file system implementations like NTFS or even the Linux file system by creating a server. So we saw that server. So once you create a server for that file system, then you can access files from other file systems also. So you don't need to modify kernel. In Linux, if you want support for other file systems, you have to change something in the kernel, and that consumes time. In this case, it's really easy. You just write one server, you put that server in your phone, and then you can access multiple other file systems. One big difference between the standard OS and this OS is because of the limited disk storage, there is no virtual memory. So anybody remembers what virtual memory is from OS class?
Memory which is there in hard disk and used for swapping.
Right. So what was the need to have something on the hard disk?
Because like some applications require more RAM and that much RAM we don't have. So
right.
Hard disk for like swapping whatever is not required.
Right. Right. So what happens is, you're almost correct. There is some minor things. So anybody knows these days how many bits are there in the processor? Had 32-bit processors. So far, recently, in 1 year, it's almost everything is going to 64 bits. So what this means is 64-bit processor. That means if you look at the CPU and its address bus, there are 64 bits here. So when you access any data, and when I say data, it also encompasses code and everything. So it can access how many different locations? Can you tell me? 2 raised to 64. Anybody knows how much is 2 raised to 64? I believe 2 raised to 32 is 4 GB. And then you can calculate what 2 raised to 64 is. Right? So what happened was, in the operating system world, we went to 32-bit processor pretty fast, like in 2000 something. And then, how much was the RAM 10 years back in the computer?
512 MB.
Yeah, 512 MB is at the most 1 GB, right? So even if the processor can access 4 GB of data, it only has, let's say, 1 MB, or sorry, 1 GB, right? So now, processor and we don't want to change the processor depending on how much RAM we have, because processor is very standard. You just go to the market, buy a processor, right? So what we need to do in the operating system, an operating system should run on 1 GB of RAM, 512 GB of RAM, or anything, right? What is the minimum and all the way everywhere. So that's the concept of virtual memory. So processor gets an impression that it has all the memory it is going to access, which is 4 GB. Okay? So processor is not worried about how much is the RAM in the computer. And now the operating system, which is the glue between hardware and software, will do lot of swapping. So what it does is, whenever, so let's say this is my 4 GB. I have 1 GB installed. So rest of the memory it's not there. So whenever processor accesses this memory, what will happen? So whenever it goes beyond 1 GB, what happens?
It will hang up because it cannot hang.
Right, but we don't want, so the system should not hang up. So the OS should do something now.
Now it can create virtual memory in the hard disk.
Right. So what it does is, this is the hard disk, let's say. This is hard disk drive. So it goes to the hard disk, and the rest of the 3 GB, it's stored somewhere here, 3 GB. Right? Hard disk is huge. So it can store everywhere. It can store all this 3 GB there. Whenever the processor accesses this memory location, it will take this data and put it somewhere here, within 1 GB. Right? So now the challenge is processor is accessing something whose address is more than 1 GB, and then the operating system has kept that data value within 1 GB. So what should happen now?
Replacement.
Replacement of what?
From that 1 GB, something should come.
That's right. So first of all, you need some empty space here in 1 GB. Then only you can put something, right? So you put it there. But now still there is an open question. Processor when it sends these data address bits here, the location, the values of these bits is something more than 1 GB. And what you have kept, the data is already kept either and modify those values, and that's where you can have multiple ways. You can have a table where you look at this value and change it. You can have some function where you do an offset and so on. You take the base address, you add the offset, and you replace it and so on. So the address bits will get all modified. So the processor is not aware that it is accessing something which is in 1 GB. It always thinks that it has all the 4 GB and it is accessing always right. All the applications that you are writing are also not aware of this. Like when you write your code, you don't worry about how much is the RAM typically. You just write the code. Like 1 GB, 4 GB, 2 GB, 3 GB, it doesn't matter. You just keep writing the code, allocating memory. Right? So all these things are taken care by operating system. And because our computer is so fast in the processor, it can do all this. You remember? So can you think of an overhead? Every instruction that goes out on the processor, on the address grid, operating system has to look at that value, modify it. Look at that value, modify it. Right? So if your computer is running at the speed of X gigahertz, and for every time you do this, maybe the actual speed gets divided by 2 there itself, X by 2, right? So that slows down the machine. And for us it's okay. If you add this delay, it's a big overhead, right? And we don't want to do that. And that's the reason there is no virtual memory account. So we'll see how it is done in the next lectures. But this memory changing is not the business that phone operating system is doing. So we looked at system calls and then system APIs. So system call is something that operating system implements in itself so that the other programs can call those functions. But for the portability reason, to move your code from one machine to another machine, every operating system gives out an API. For example, Linux and Unix will have its own API, like POSIX API, Windows will have Win32 APIs, and so on. Right? So what happens in Symbian OS? So in Symbian OS, you remember there is a kernel and then there is a server, right? So an application program first has to talk to the server and then it will go to the system call. Right? So system call is something that is going inside the kernel. So we have another call which is called executive call. So executive call is a request for the kernel to execute an operation in the privileged mode on behalf of the user space requester. So anybody knows, so let me first explain what a software interrupt is. So you know what interrupt is? Do you know? What is an interrupt? It's not undefined, it's defined.
But any defined external signal which causes the processor to
Right. So in the embedded system or hardware world, what happens is, so this is an interrupt. Right. So there is a ping on the processor, and if you change its voltage value, let's say 0 to 5 volts, you go from 0 to 5 volts, you are telling the processor to execute something now. Right? So it's like, start whatever you are doing, service my request. Right? So that is an interrupt. And there are lots of interrupt bits with all the priorities defined on the processor. And these are all hardware interrupts. So you have to actually change the voltage and that will cause an interrupt. In Linux or an operating system like Linux, there is something called a software interrupt. So whenever you make a system call, it's actually a software interrupt. So all the things that happens with the interrupt will be done. So anybody knows what happens when I raise the pin? Raise the pin as in, if I raise the voltage at this pin on the processor, what happens? What is the sequence of operations the processor will go through?
Actually,
Right? And then? Okay, so the first part is correct. So you will have to store something. But then what happens?
so what it does, firstly it checks if it is now good enough to service that request.
Okay.
If it passes that test, then it will service that. But before doing that, it will save the program counter to some place.
Right. So what is servicing mean? What is the servicing?
Means saving the current program counter to the stack and then jumping to the location of the ISR.
ISR, right. So there is something called an interrupt vector table or interrupt table. So you have all the types of interrupts here. Right? So let's say there is a number here. Every interrupt has a unique ID. 0, 1, 2. Right? From 10. And then for everything, what is the address? There is some address stored here. What this address does is it points to an interrupt service routine, ISR. Right? So whenever an interrupt happens, you first save the state, program counter, all the register values and everything. Operating system, after doing all these checks about whether it can service the interrupt. If it can service the interrupt, look in the table and find out what is the number, take the corresponding address, go to that particular ISR, execute that interrupt service routine. Once it finishes it, comes back, restore the program counter and all the state, and the operating system will function. Right? So this is how it happens. So what happens is to maintain similarity between the actual hardware and the software, they design the concept of software interrupt. So you don't need to change the voltage on any pin to cause the software interrupt. You just have to say a number here. Right? And that will cause the same interrupt. So anybody has done this in software, sending an interrupt. Do you know?
In microcontrollers, we have done like.
Right. But in the standard operating system, when you send signals, so what happens when you're running a C program and it takes this long time? What do? Control C. So basically control C is also a signal that you send, right? And when you send it, it does the same thing, the software interrupt and ISR. So you know how do you kill a process? Terminate a process. In Linux. Yes. In Linux or Unix? Kill, right?
Kill and process.
So this is again, you're telling that send this signal and when I execute this, it will cause an interrupt service routine. Right? So everything, when you talk to any process, it's through signal and that means it's through the interrupts. Right? So call, whenever you do an executive call, it causes a software interrupt which is serviced by branching inside the kernel code. So interrupt is serviced, it should be D here, and control is passed back to the user. Executive calls, so there is a restriction, they can modify kernel space objects. So whatever is inside the kernel, they can modify the state, but cannot create or delete them. So that's the restriction given by the operating system. Then the kernel server request. So this is something that you do with the server, and then when the server contacts the kernel, it's again a system call. So this is typically what we do in Linux. A server that protects the kernel resources and requests to manipulate those requests needed to go through that server. And server requests are themselves executive calls. Right? So these are the two levels of indirection that we go through in Symbian OS. So in summary with this, so the introduction and the character of this operating system. So what we saw is everything is not through file. Everything is through objects and through the communication mode is client server. Right? You directly cannot do that. Then the system calls is divided into two different levels. One is the executive call and then the kernel service request. And another thing we saw is to save on the processing of the operating systems, you do not have virtual memory. Right? And the file system is FAT32. It's the simplest one and most portable one. So you can connect the phone to any machine and you should be able to access its file system. But then if you want to implement another file system, you just have to write your own server that will give you that other file system. So any questions on this part? Three different. Yeah, so I have posted assignment too, by the way. So it's I forgot the due date, but it's there. Second phase. Actually, it has first phase. So it has three small midlets, and then so I think first two are independent, and this third one is built on the first two. Right? But when you write the code, everything has to be separate. So you write 3 Java files normally, and then submit them. So now we'll go inside the kernel. So if you look at now the kernel and the whole operating system as in the circular fashion, what happens is that in the very core it's a nano kernel to separate it from the microkernel. So it's very basic things, and we'll see what exactly in the nano kernel. Then there is some kernel things which are around this, but this totally will form the microkernel. Then what's running around it, around the kernel, and then there is user mode application. In the other operating system, this is not there. So you don't have servers. You just directly have the kernel and the application. But in this case, there is a server and everything will go through the server. So what's inside nano kernel? So this has to be very, very basic. So what is the minimal thing that you need to run the machine? Only those things you will implement in the system. So it's a simple thread operating in a privilege mode. So there is something called a privilege mode. And so what is a privilege mode?
All the permissions are granted.
Right. So in operating system, what happens is the operating system has to save itself from, let's say, malicious user first of all, and second thing is sometimes there is no malicious user, but the application is written in such a way that it can corrupt the operating system, right? So for example, you open up a file, you read write file, you open up RAM or memory locations, you read and write them, and if your memory is not handled properly, you can actually corrupt them. Most of the attacks are trying to do the same thing, right? So in the old version, so when everything started with 8086 processor, right? Then it was 85 and then 86, when actually the processor, multiprocessor, which can run operating system, were being designed by Intel, there was no concept of privilege mode. So all the MS-DOS and other systems that you would see, what happens is, in the first version, you can write the code and you can change the operating system itself. So even your simple C program can look at the code of the operating system, change something, so that the operating system is being changed dynamically. Now what people realize that this is not a good model. It can corrupt your machine. So after this, they decided to have a privilege mode. Right? So there is a bit, just one bit. When it is set, it is in the privilege mode or the root mode or the super user mode. Otherwise, it's in the standard general user mode. Right? Now, what happens is, if you're running the code, then you should not be allowed to change this bit. Right? What happens if the user is allowed to change this bit? User application, it can just change the bit, become the super user and execute everything. Right? So first restriction is, the standard user is not, the general user is not allowed to change this bit. So it is protected. Only operating system can do this. And how will the operating system do it? So how do you tell? Through APIs or through system calls. So whenever you want to execute something in the kernel which is privileged, what you do is you cause an interrupt. That interrupt, when it happens, the control is given to the operating system, because ISR, remember, is stored within the operating system. So all that table and ISR is stored within the operating system. So that code is protected, right? And then when it goes there, then it sets the bit, executes everything, unset the bit, and then you get the control, or the user gets the control, right? So these are the operations that privilege mode does. So in nano kernel, this is all in privilege mode. So everything happens to as a super user. The most basic thing that you need, I was saying again, it's scheduling, and that's what is done in nano kernel. So process scheduling and synchronization operations. So if you have multiple threads, you need to synchronize the data. Otherwise, the data will be corrupted. You do the interrupt handling, mutex. Do you know what mutex and semaphores are? Mutual exclusion. So when two processes are accessing the same data for writing, at least one is writing, right? Then you have to make sure that that data is not corrupted. Otherwise, the value will be corrupted. So all the basic things like scheduling, synchronization, interrupt handling, these mutex and semaphores are handled by nano kernel, and that's it. So that gives you the basic operating system. So you can run the nano kernel and your phone will start executing the simple processes. Most of the functions can be preempted. This is very important. So what is preemption?
Stopping and then continuing.
Stopping and continuing. So what happens is I can stop any instruction at any time and execute something. So what is the advantage? Why do they decided that almost all the operations should be able to preempt themselves?
To process the system calls important things first,
Right.
and then
Right.
so that nothing is like start.
Start, right? So what happens in the hardware, if you when you write anything, like if you go from user level to operating system to the kernel to the nano kernel, your operation should be as tiny as possible. Because there are lots of interrupts. Everything is handled through interrupts. For example, even the clock that you are maintaining, right? So there is a clock and every second it has to tick. So every second it has to tick. If the clock says 1 second has advanced and the operating system does not change the time in that second, the time is wrong, right? The radio bits are coming, the phone call is coming, and there is an interrupt created by the radio signal. You have to service that interrupt. If you don't service that interrupt, you lose the message, right? Because the message is already in the air. It's already floating around. It has been sent by the base station. Now you have to accept that message. And accept it, you have to lock to the signal. So it's all ones and zeros, like this. Right? So you have to lock. Lock as if, so this is 1 bit. High energy. Right? So this is high energy. So the clock should be accurate first of all. And then when it detects that this is high energy, it should also capture everything, right? And then if this is low energy, it should get all those values. Otherwise, what will happen is, if you miss out this, then what you read in the radio would be something like this. Like if you miss out this part. So that is what locking is. So all these things are handled through interrupt. So if you're maintaining the clock, immediately, so as much as possible the processor should be idle or busy. Idle. So as much as possible, the processor should be idle. If the processor is idle, then only you can service this interrupt immediately. If your processor is continuously busy, that means you will miss the interrupts. And most of the things, bad things happen because you miss the interrupts. Right? So this concept clear. So when you write the code as much as possible in an embedded system or anything which is in the operating system, try to do everything quickly and finish it. So most of the functions can be preempted, so that's why the system is responsive. Operations are primitive and fast, so you don't do very big computation like exponential operations and this and that. Everything you do like a shift operation, addition, subtraction, if then else, that's it. You don't do big mathematical calculation. And there is no dynamic memory allocation. And this is again coming. Because what happens with the dynamic memory? What is the challenge? So runtime, first of all, you have to go and search for the memory, right? And searching means you have to somewhere keep a record that this much memory is full and this much memory is empty, right? Another thing, what happens with the dynamic memory? Once you allocate usage, what is the other thing the operating system has to continuously do when you do dynamic? Free the memory. in garbage collection. So periodically run this code of garbage collection, see which pointers are still reference, which pointers are out of scope, collect this memory, reclaim this memory. It's a lot of overhead. So to eliminate all of that, there is no dynamic memory allocation in nano kernel. So kernel is very simple. Also the nano kernel is very simple. So this is basic part of the kernel. On top of that, there are some more operations that you will need to complete the whole kernel. So again, each operation is privileged because still you are within the kernel, and it combines all the primitive operations of the nano kernel and create a kernel. So you use basically all these operations and then you use that. So examples are objects now, right? So here we did not have anything object oriented. Everything was basic. And now we are giving an interface of objects to the outside world. Create an objects, user mode threads. So this is all kernel threads here, and then this is where so the user can create his own thread. So if user wants to have a multi-threaded program, through the kernel API, he can create the threads. Then process scheduling, context switching and everything for the user, dynamic memory. So here you start giving access to the dynamic memory. And dynamic loading of libraries. What is dynamic? So what is the other thing? There is dynamic loading, and what is other thing? Static loading. Okay, so what is the difference? Can anybody tell me what is the difference between dynamic loading and static loading? Or if you don't know the difference, at least give me an example.
So like the static library is attached with the executable.
Right.
It is there.
Right.
Dynamic, it is a common thing which multiple people can, multiple apps can.
Right. So you have used in C something called stdio.h, right? And there are so many C programs that are running on the machine who are using stdio.h. Now what happens with stdio.h? Every time you use stdio.h, so what happens? Otherwise, let's see, what is the concept of .h file? You include something, code is copied and you use that code. When you create an exe, everything is compiled and you execute it, right? So your code becomes bigger. Even if you just write 10 lines of code, the code is bigger. But let's say this is the kind of library everybody is using, standard input output. If everybody is linked, everybody's code is linked with this .h and it's all executable, what will happen? Every code is becoming bigger, right? And there are so many pieces of code running in the C which are using the same thing. So what is the solution?
The solution is that you just put one file stdio.h and link all the other files to this, and whenever like it accesses a function which is defined in this,
yes,
it will go to this file.
Right. So but that is still challenging. I mean, all the codes. So one thing is to have something which is pointing in the code and you use the same code, right? Right. So if you delete that file, all the code will have undefined references and so on.
No, means it's like there only like it will there like this the function is defined in this, or we can have a link between both.
Right. So the link, how the linking is done is it's called dynamic linking and dynamic loading. What happens is there is already a compiled code of stdio.h. Which is typically in the Linux world, if you go to /lib, you will find this userlib or /lib. Inside is all the libraries are there, and they have compiled version of all these standard things, stdio.h and so on, right? Time.h. And those code are there. It's already compiled, it's executable, but it's stored there. When somebody writes his own code of stdio.h, the operating system in the exe just mentions that this needs compiled code of stdio.h. Right? So in your exe, there is something written in there. It needs this library. When you start this exe, when you run this or execute this exe, at runtime, operating system sees this, goes to this location. Let's say this is called libstdio.h or libstdio. There is no .h now. Right? So it loads this code inside memory. Okay, so this is your RAM. It will put this lib stdio here. Okay? It keeps it in the memory. And now your code exe is here. Whenever it says printf or scanf from str.h, it goes here and executes it. When it finishes it, it comes back here. And this is how the exe will execute now. Okay. So let's say your friend also write an exe program. He calls it exe, right, exe dash. He also has str.h. What happens now? Same. So what happens is, with this exe, you don't need to now load this libstdio. It's already there in the memory. So you just, whenever he calls it, again goes to the libstdio.h, which is already there. Now for your code, there is a little overhead, because it has to load something in the memory and then execute. That overhead is just one time. Now next time somebody calls this stdio, that code is already there in the memory. And so this first, the thing is, when I say dynamic loading, that means first of all, you don't load everything inside the memory. Whenever at runtime you need it, then only you will load it. And another advantage is, everybody can share this code. So your memory is safe. Otherwise you will have multiple of these libstdio copies of this inside your RAM, and it will merge to your RAM. So this is being done in kernel, and that's something, I mean, even if there is an overload at once, it's fine, because then you save the RAM. This is also fully preemptible, because kernel, I mean, as much as possible, the code should be preemptible. Can you give me an example of a code which is not preemptible? What do you do when you don't want to preempt yourself? Transactions, or in the synchronizations, or in the concurrency, right? All the mutex and semaphore, all these operations. Now they define as something called atomic. Right? You know, or you in the database terms it is called lock and unlock. Or in the semaphore it is wait, right? This is a P signal and S signal and so on, right? So all of these operations make your code non-preemptible. So if you say atomic and you execute something on that variable X here, you are telling operating system that do not preempt my code at any cost for this much time. And that means if there is a clock value that needs to be updated, you will miss that clock. Right? So if you write your whole code in this semaphore operations, it will make your operating system problem. Right? So it will create lots of issues with the operating system because it cannot service the interrupts. So it is fully preemptible. Interrupts can execute this layer to reschedule any part of its execution. So you still can service all the interrupts even in the middle of context switching. So in fact, even when one process is being swapped out and another process is being swapped in, it is doing something. Even within that operation, you can create an interrupt and tell operating system to do something else. Right? So this is how you almost minimize the use of this lock and unlock and atomic operations. This is how the kernel.
But sometimes it's necessary to use.
Sometimes it's necessary, right? So even for example, when you update your clock value for that momentary value, right? You will say other interrupts. I will not service other interrupts. So for example, whenever you change your time, you will put it in atomic because you don't want to have some other interrupt, and because that will corrupt the value of the time. Right? So some operations you have to do this, but as much as possible, don't do this. So this is how the nano kernel and the kernel on top of it. Okay, so we are moving slowly away from the kernel. So the other thing which is new now here is the server. There is the server and then finally the user mode applications. So what do all servers do? So these do not require any privileged operations. These are outside the kernel, and by definition also they don't, because it is outside the kernel, you don't have this privileged mode operation. Right? So, and a lot of times you don't need privileged operations. For example, you want to send network packets, data packets. Right? So in Linux, everything will go inside the kernel. All the MAC addressing, TCP/IP, everything will happen inside the kernel in the privileged mode, and the packet is sent out. But typically you don't need. Just to assemble the packet, check the CRC value and so on. Why do you need privileged mode? Right? Anybody can do it. So all of this thing done outside the kernel, let's say by a server here. So if you want to send the radio packet, most of the assembly of packet and everything will be done outside the kernel. Only time when you really want to send this radio packet outside, you will have this system call, and then the packet goes out. Right? So the server will handle most of the operations. It's not privileged. Example, this is, as I was talking about, working with sockets. Let's say if you want to receive and send network data, or even the display. Right? So there is in display. First of all, you have to create the display, set the color values and everything. Once you have the entire screen ready as an image, then only you will push it to the display. So the final operation you will need to have privileged, because you are modifying the hardware. But the rest of the operations you can just do without the privilege. So usually runs as a user mode service, and when they require something which is being done by kernel, they will call this kernel based operations. So it is done as less as possible. So this is the idea of server, right? So this is how it becomes faster now. Because whenever you change the mode of non-privileged to privileged, again that's an overload. But now you minimize this in this operating system as compared to our computer operating system. And user mode is something that you write in Java programming. It's run completely in the user mode, so there is no privileged operation. Kernel-based operations are either by interrupts with servers. So you talk to the server by through an interrupt and then execute something, or by making system call that activate the kernel. So you can directly also call kernel, but as much as possible do it through the server if you need to. So let's stop here today because I need to go. But I need to discuss with you. There are some students who want to discuss the project. So today I'm finishing a little early because I have to leave. So any questions so far on this? So I will start from here itself next time. So this also is uploaded and last is also uploaded. So last night I uploaded. Right, it's also that
even these slides are uploaded.
Yes,
please.